Hey class, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over user ID. Now, user ID is functionality within the Palo Alto firewall. So taking a step back, traditional firewalls usually use IP addresses to filter and enforce security policies, but that's relatively static and it's going to be unreliable when we're in a dynamic network. Now, what user ID does is it shifts security policies to focus on user identities. User identities more so allows you to have allow and deny rules based off of users, who you are, or a user group. And we can go into that in a little bit. But this gives us granularity, visibility, allows us to be exactly know who the threat is, right? If something suspicious is happening, we can pinpoint the exact user account coming from the exact network. So it really helps when you combine it with app ID and using IP addresses, because here's the thing. In traditional firewalls, when we want to allow deny based off of IP addresses, what if there's 100 user accounts coming from one specific, or devices coming from one IP address, right? How do we know exactly, pinpoint who is the bad actor out of those 100 people? So the user ID, being able to have policies based off of user accounts, really does help, pinpoint and be more granular of who the threat actor is, or allow or deny and ensure authorized access. Now, let's go ahead and get started. We can scroll down here a little bit. We already went over user ID, the purposes of a little bit, why it's important, enables tracking of users across multiple devices, strengthens security policies by enforcing them at the user level, reduces incident response time by identifying users in security logs. So when you have traffic logs coming in, it directly tells you who the user account was, so you can go out and filter based off of that user account and see their behavior, where they're going, and track them. And then supports compliance with regulations by logging user-based activities. So you may want to have them specifically access one specific application, and this is more so for user groups. So you may want a group to have access to one specific application and another group not. So it gives you that granularity in that sense. Now, user ID, you can either you can create policies specifically based on individual user accounts or based off of user groups. Now, user groups are more so, you can kind of say, I want this security policy against all administrative accounts, or this policy based off of all guest accounts, right? Things that have user accounts that have the same security role, you can group them together to have a little more dynamic security policy against them. But you can even go individually and more granular if you need to. Now, user ID main functions, you'll see here, before you can actually leverage user ID, you have to import, I don't want to say import, but you have to connect and get the database of your, the firewall uses a group mapping and user mapping to collect all available users that are going to be part of that network or environment. So before you can create any user-based or group-based policy rules, you have to know who the users are, right? So PAN, right? Palo Alto has different APIs to connect to your directory services to grab that information. And it does this through a protocol called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, to talk to your directory services. Whatever directory services that you use, usually the most known directory services is Active Directory, which is going to be sitting on your domain controller. And it just pulls that information. and then you can create and leverage policy rules, security policies against those users and user groups. Now, user mapping associates IP addresses with usernames. It uses multiple methods like Active Directory authentication logs, session monitoring, or global protect to map an IP address with a specific username. But on the other hand, group mapping, it learns group names and member users from LDAP. So it associates usernames with group memberships in LDAP directories. So if there's groups in your Active Directory, you can directly assign groups from your Active Directory. And it allows firewall policies to be applied based on group membership instead of individual users if you want to be a little more dynamic. It helps with administration because imagine if you have 10,000 users in your environment, you're going to have 10,000, user security policies, right? And that gets a little overwhelming, right? So you'll see here, user ID technology has 4 main components. It has the Palo Alto Networks firewall, which the characteristics are it maps IP addresses to usernames, maps usernames to group names. Then PAN-OS integrated user ID agent, which runs on the firewall. It collects IP addresses to username information. And then you have the Windows-based user ID agent, which runs on a domain controller, collects IP address to username information, sends information to the firewall. And then the PAN terminal service agent, which runs on Microsoft and Citrix terminal service, collects IP and port number to username information and sends information to the firewall. Now, the way Palo Alto actually collects and maps out those user IDs to be able to push security policies against them, there's 2 specific ways. One way is that there's an integrated agent that resides on the firewall itself, and then there's another one, there's a Windows-based agent. The Windows-based agent is actually something that's downloaded on your Windows server. And what happens is that the agent keeps track of login information. Like whenever someone logs in, it takes a look what IP address it came from. And it kind of maps out, it creates an association database of this user account came from this IP address. Okay? It takes a look at CISS logs. It takes a look at AD logins, domain controller logs, and various other sources as needed. Once that agent is the Windows-based agent is collecting that information, it creates and builds a map. This user account is associated with this IP address. It creates that map, that database, and then it sends it to the Palo Alto firewall. And then the firewall applies security rules based on user groups and memberships and so on. Now, on the other hand, the integrated on the firewall agent, what that does, the firewall itself talks to the AD and domain controllers directly and builds the user to IP mapping with no external Windows servers needed. Okay? This is best for small and medium deployments with fewer logins or fewer domain controllers. That mapping is done on the firewall rather than the Windows agent. That mapping is done on that domain controller of the server, the Active Directory. So when you use which one, whenever you have a smaller network, it's not as complicated. You can use it on the firewall itself, the integrated version on the firewall. But if you have a very complex network, a lot of user accounts coming in from a wide variety of places, it's best to have it on the Active Directory because you also get the best information because there's a lot of different sources connected to your AD, and it can map a little better and be a little more accurate. And it's a little more scalable. Okay. Now, integrated versus Windows-based agent, we kind of went through this already. Let's go to user mapping methods and overview. Now, the user ID technology includes multiple methods to map IP addresses to users, and how that gets mapped is based off of how you want to map it, based off of your specific network infrastructure. There's different ways, including Global Protect, syslogs again, Microsoft AD domain controllers, different probes used. Also, your user ID can consume PAN OS XML API user accounts and login messages sent from terminal servers like NAC systems, network access control systems. Now, user mapping using Global Protect. Every Global Protect user, so Global Protect is kind of what's used for VPN. It's Palo Alto's VPN specific service. Every Global Protect user is required to enter in login credentials to access a firewall to get into your specific environment, especially when you're coming from an external network. Global Protect directly adds the username to the firewall user ID mapping table, and is the best solution for high security environments because it works. I wouldn't say best, but because it's very dependent on what firewall you're using. But if you're using a Palo Alto firewall, it's the easiest to configure and get the best mapping to use the same VPN, Global Protect, because it's just ease of use, because there's similar technology. Usually when technologies are built, the vendor or the tech company usually makes sure that the functionalities of different services that they provide work together specifically. So proprietary technologies usually work best with their own technologies, right? So that's not always the case, right? Specifically for Global Protect, it's a little easier. It logs that information a lot smoother. Now, user ID syslog monitoring, so monitors syslog events for login and logout messages. Messages are used to update IP addresses to username mappings. Syslog parses profiles, enables interoperability with diverse syslog types. So if you are not using like Global Protect and you're using a different VPN solution, and that VPN solution is providing logs to a SIM, and you're getting syslogs, you can ingest those syslogs to be able to do that mapping. Okay. Let's see. And this goes beyond just like VPN. This includes different directory services like Apple's Open Directory, or if you have a NAC, network access control. You can configure these services to send syslog messages and contain information about login and logout events, and configure your user ID agent to parse through those messages. Okay, so let's go ahead and scroll down here. So user ID operation overview, domain controllers. So before a user ID can actually operate, it must be enabled in a security zone. If user ID is enabled, the firewall consults the administrator defined user ID configuration to determine which agents the firewall has available to gather IP addresses and user information. Depending on the configuration, user ID on the firewall could query either an integrated or a Windows-based agent. The agent retrieves IP addresses and usernames information from the domain controller. So what does this mean? So essentially, a user ID has to be enabled on a security zone. Think of a zone as a neighborhood of traffic inside the firewall. For example, your inside LAN zone versus your outside internet zone. If a user ID is off, the firewall only knows about traffic in terms of IP address. If user ID is on, the firewall can start attaching usernames to those IP addresses, letting you write policies like only members in the finance group can access these payroll servers. Okay? So user ID must be enabled on the security zones themselves. And remember, security zones is in module 3, if I'm not mistaken. Then the firewall will check which agent it can use. So is it using Windows-based user ID agent or the integrated on-the-box user ID agent? All right. Then, based off of the different agent that it's using, the Windows-based, which is an agent on your directory services, or the one on the firewall itself, regardless of which type you use, it's going to do the same job. It's going to retrieve user to IP information from Active Directory and map those together. Okay? Now, user ID control monitoring. So monitors security logs of domain controllers and monitors all domain controllers per domain to get all login and logout events. Okay? So this really helps with better incident response by showing which users access which applications. So to ensure that security events are recorded in the security logs, note that AD domain must be configured to log successful account login events. Now, when someone logs into your network, they might log into any domain controller because you may have multiple and it's not always going to be the same. But domain controllers don't share the login logs with each other. So if you only watch one DC domain controller, you're going to get lost and you're not going to get you're going to miss the logins. So that's why you need user ID agent to watch all the domain controllers. If you're deploying it on the Windows type, you need the user ID agent on all your domain controllers, so everything goes back to the PAN firewall to be able to map and put all those together, all those logins together. A single user ID agent can handle multiple domain controllers. It's going to be the same agent, but it needs to be on all of the domain controllers. But it can handle multiple domains at once. And then watching the domain controller logs doesn't use much system resources, and it usually catches most users quickly. So Palo Alto really recommends this is a main way to map usernames to IP rather than using the on-board integrated system on the firewall itself. They really push to actually roll it out onto your directory services. Now, user ID Windows session monitoring, the server logs session information when the server logs session information when users connect to shared printers or files. Session monitoring is used to maintain known IP addresses to user mappings. Like I mentioned before, it tracks user activity pretty much and creates reports and logs, and provides better incident response by showing which users access which applications, in this case files or print servers. Right? You can directly know who accessed what. Now, these are just a list of different user ID mapping recommendations. So if you have Windows file and print shares, use session monitoring, different monitoring services, right? If you have Global Protect VPN clients, use Global Protect. Non-Windows systems, use syslog listener, and so on. Now, the next few sections, it's mostly focusing around configurations, and you're going to be doing the configurations of user ID in your labs. So we'll go ahead and skip the next few sections just for the purpose of this video. It goes more into detail in the lab assignments of configuring group mapping, configuring user ID, and agent configurations. So I think that would take us pretty much to the last section. Let's just jump there real quick, the user ID and security policy. So once you created that user ID, it can now, and it's configured, it can be now used to enforce firewall policies or those security policies. You can assign different source user options, any, pre-login, known user, unknown, select. So when you select users for the security policy, these options are available, the 5 that I just listed. When you select any, it matches any value for the user. Okay, pretty self-explanatory. Pre-login, it's used with certain global protection implementations. Known user matches any user or group identified by the user ID. Unknown matches traffic where user ID methods cannot identify the user. And then select matches a specific user or group identified by the user ID. So select is very specific. Unknown is something that you cannot identify. Known matches any user or group identified by user ID. Any allows any. Pre-login is used with global protect. Okay. When using a user group in a policy rule, remember that source address field and the source user field are evaluated with a logical and condition. A logic and a condition. So these security policies that are being analyzed, or these logins, this traffic that's coming in and it's hitting against the security policies, it's really looking at the source more so. In the beginning, say, okay, who's this user that's coming in? All right. So you kind of see like the traffic, the source traffic is going to be analyzed specifically with user ID because it's trying to see who's trying to access what. Okay. User and groups can only be used in a policy rule if they are known on the firewall. For larger environments, a best practice is configuring policy rules based on groups rather than individual users. The number of users often become more unwieldy for defining policy as the number of users in an environment increases. So, brought that up earlier. For if you want a little more dynamic, use the user groups rather than individual users. Now, dynamic user groups. DUGs. DUGs allow real-time access control by dynamically assigning users to security groups based on activity, including security, authentication, and encryption policies. So essentially, whenever there's a new user, it kind of assigns them directly to a user group based off of different heuristics. Unlike static groups where you actually have to define each individual user that goes into that user group, DUG membership changes automatically based on conditions. Like I mentioned, security events, IPs, protocols, MAC addresses, metadata, and behavior. So this is really used in zero trust policy security to enforce least privilege principle. They have to verify, not implicitly trust. Okay, this user is within your environment. So rather than allowing them access because they're part of, they come in and they're part of your environment, let's immediately assign them to use DUG, immediately assign them to a user group based off of what they're doing and their role and the heuristics, the metadata, their IP addresses, force them into a group, whether if it's someone you know or someone you don't know. You put them in a controlled environment so that you can apply security policies. So they're not just individually hanging out there, right? Let's put them part of a group membership so they can have those specific security policies assigned based off of what they're doing. Don't just implicitly trust anyone that's in your environment. So for example, if a user logs in from an untrusted device, they're automatically moved to a restricted security group, right? That's dynamically assigning someone to a user group. So this is just an example. You collect user traffic, and then based off of the firewall logs, your SIM, UABA, your SOC tools, you tag username to define a DUG membership, use DUG memberships to control user access, and use time-based user access controls. Create a policy with access controlled by the DUG membership, add time-based tag to username. Policy provides access to DUG members, tag expires and access automatically is revoked. So best practices, I know we hit the module summary. I just do want to go over a couple best practices. Remember to enable user ID only for internal network zones. Avoid external traffic when we want to enable user ID. So only do it for your internal environment. That's like the best practice in terms of best way to utilize it. When you start using it externally, it does become more complex and usability goes down. Use multiple agents for redundancy and performances. So what that means is when you have multiple use domain controllers. Use the Windows-based agent and implement the Windows-based agent on all your domain controllers, and have all your domain controllers come back and to the firewall to map it. Okay, try to avoid doing it solely on the firewall itself. Okay, limit WMI probing when only use it when necessary, and monitor logs to verify accurate user mapping. Okay. But all in all, that kind of wraps up this user ID. It's relatively intuitive that you're essentially mapping user IDs to IP addresses, and then you're allowing traffic to come in and out based off of the user ID or the user group to get access to resources. And the way you do that is you have to have some type of device or agent on your directory services, your domain controller, your Active Directory, to map the user IDs with IP addresses. Or you can have the Palo Alto firewall do that for you, which is not recommended. It's very resource intensive and it's not very dynamic and scalable. But once you get that mapping, then you can apply security policies against the mapping, the user groups, the user identities. Okay, and that's really important for granularity, being able to identify who's the threat actor, especially when it comes to incident response. All right. Now with that wraps this up. I hope everyone had a wonderful time. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see everyone soon. Thanks. Bye.